In this next session, you'll see Chris Atkins being interviewed by Steve Ansell. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to Chris Atkins. So Chris Atkins is a BAFTA-nominated filmmaker. His documentaries, Taking Liberties and Starsuckers, were critically acclaimed and made front-page news. He's also worked extensively with Dispatches for Channel 4 and BBC Panorama. Well, like most people, Chris didn't spend much time thinking about prisons. But after a dodgy scheme to fund his latest film, he was sent down for 5 years. His new home was Wandsworth, one of the largest and most dysfunctional of Victorian prisons in Europe. With a cast of characters ranging from wily drug dealers to senior officials bent on endless but ineffective reform, this powerful memoir uncovers the horrifying reality behind the locked doors. Filled with dark humour and shock, a bit of a stretch, The Diaries of a Prisoner reveals why our creaking prison system is costing us all. So, Chris, well,
hello.
First of all, welcome to the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. I guess let's get the offence out of the way. It was a bit of a surprise to you, was it?
Well, the going to prison part was a surprise, but the thing itself, the criminal action itself, it actually rumbled on for a number of years. You do sort of die a death by 1,000 cuts with these things. So I got involved in a tax avoidance scheme, not to avoid my own tax, I hasten to add, because I didn't earn very much money, but we were filmmakers at the time, this is in the mid-noughties, were getting films funded by taking money from sort of limited liability partnerships that were made up of celebrities and footballers and rich bankers. And you'll have seen a lot about this in the news. People like Jimmy Carr and David Beckham ended up putting money into these things. And then so they would put their money in, we would get some cash from them to make the film, and they would write it off against tax. And huge amounts of cash were sort of swilling through the system over the years. And as HMRC began to quite rightly kind of clamp down on this, the accountants at the centre of it started finding ever more kind of colourful ways to sort of dodge the loopholes and game the system, essentially. So one film we made took some money from one of these funds, and essentially they asked us to do some stuff that we really shouldn't have been doing on an accounting front in order to inflate the budget. And years and years later, HMRC came and investigated and decided to prosecute everyone involved, the partners, the accountant, and me, the producer. So, yeah, I got done for tax fraud and got sent away for 5 years.
The producer has to take a lot of responsibility, don't they, out on a shoot, but not necessarily that for the accountant.
Yeah, exactly. But, I do put my hands up and say, look, it was pretty stinky what we'd ended up getting involved in. And so I don't sort of, bemoan the judgment at all. It was a shock to get 5 years. But when you start breaking it down, you go, well, you only serve 2.5. The other 2.5 is out in the community on license. And then of the 2.5 behind bars, because you're sort of a white collar criminal and you're seen as quite low risk, and it was my first offence, they said, well, look, you do a few months in proper prison, so that's your punishment. And then once you've sort of done your hard time, you can then go to open prison, where you're going out into the community each day and going to see your family and spending overnights with your kids and stuff like that. So it becomes a lot easier after you've done the first bit of hard time. So I did 9 months. It ended up being 9 months I spent in Wandsworth, which was the real proper prison. And after that, it didn't really count as jail time at all.
It must have been a bit of a shock to everyone that you knew then, and I guess it was it is a big shock to the system, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it was also kind of doubly odd because I built this career and sort of media sort of persona really as someone who was fighting wrongdoing. So my films were always quite critical of people in power and companies and institutions who we thought had transgressed in some way. So it was odd to go from that. And so lots of people had just knew me through my work, doing dispatches, panoramas, and sort of uncovering bad people, to then be in the dock myself. There was an ironic twist to it. That's, it's one way of looking at it.
It certainly was. What about your family and being ripped away from your very young son?
Yeah, well, that was the worst bit. People always say, well, what's the worst bit about prison? And it isn't actually the violence or the drugs or anything like that. There is quite a bit of that. For me, because you get used to so much. I mean, that's the thing I always say. The human body and mind is extraordinarily adaptable. So actually, after a while, you just get used to your surroundings. It all just becomes normal. The one thing I never stopped missing and never stopped being extremely painful was the separation from my son. So he was just 4 when I went away. I went away just for his 4th birthday. And I separated from his mum, but we were still all very close. We shared him 50-50. So he spent half the week with me, half the week with her. And so therefore it was a big wrench. Yes, certainly. Not being in his life and him not being in my life.
Well, most of us who've never been inside a prison have a preconceived set of ideas. Did you, before you went in?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, I thought, I know what prison's going to be like because I'd seen Porridge and I'd seen The Shawshank Redemption,
Yes.
And it didn't take long of being on the inside to realise that is, those representations are pretty wide of the mark. I mean, obviously, there's elements of it. You think, well, yeah, you're in a cell and there's angry guards and stuff like that. But I think the thing that, and there's since been quite a lot on prisons again, sort of since there's just been a BBC drama with Sean Bean, and there's Orange is the New Black. It's like a perennial thing that people like, and there is a fascination with prisons, but none of them get close to capturing the sheer dysfunctionality of the place. You have this feeling that because it's run by these kind of quasi-military types, that everything seems to be quite kind of brutally efficient. But it wasn't. I mean, it was just complete organizational mess, really, on a kind of massive scale. But because it's very difficult to report on prisons, they don't allow journalists in, they don't allow cameras in. So they're kind of like sealed worlds. So it means that there's no transparency, which means they can carry on failing. And they're sort of the practices of how they run the place are all sort of stuck in the 1970s, really.
Take us back to your day of trial. I'm not too sure how prepared you were, or indeed, the judge wasn't particularly favourable to you.
No, but I always say he had a job to do. I never like falling into that cliche of sort of shaking your fist at the lawyers and the judges. They were doing a job and they carried it out reasonably effectively. So yeah, but it's all down to the mundane things like, well, what do I take? What do I pack? And I think if I'd had my time again, I'd have kind of packed better than I did this time. So yeah, it's like, can I take a toothbrush? What books can I take? Can I take a notebook? And it was all stuff like that. And then you read, there's a lot of stuff online saying, here's what you can and can't take to prison with you. So it's like your first taste of the dysfunctionality of the system. So you base what you take on that, and then you turn up and there's sort of, you can't have this, you can't have this, you can't have this. It's like, oh, that's what the website said. So yeah, it was even weird things like I took a notebook. I just took a notebook and it had a hard back and that metal spiral spine thing. And they took one look at that and said, you can't have that, you could use that as a weapon. And I thought, not a very effective weapon. I'm sure a stick or a knife would be better than a notebook. They took my notebook away, so I couldn't take. So it was just weird things like that.
And your watch was taken away.
Yeah, I had a new. I don't normally. I am now actually, but at the time I never wore a watch because everyone uses a phone, don't they? You can't take a phone. So on the blogs it said take a watch because you can never know what the time is in prison, and it really does your head in not knowing the time. So but don't take an expensive watch because it'll be nicked or you get stolen or whatever. So take a really cheap plastic watch. So I've got a cheap plastic watch. And they said, you can't have that. What? It's got a stopwatch on. And so put it in. You have a prop box where they store all your stuff that you can't take into the prison. So they don't destroy it. You get it when you leave. It's like, I don't want it when I leave. I want it now. But they said, yeah, it's got a stopwatch on. And took it. I was like, why would a stopwatch be a... But you never know. You get all... And it's like your first taste really into this just mindless list of endless rules. I think maybe in the 1950s when... Johnny Biggs, the great train robber, escaped from Wandsworth. He did it by timing how long it took guards to walk around the yard or something like that. So they said, right, from now on, no more stopwatches. And it's remained on the books ever since.
What was it like being carted off from the courtroom and entering this Victorian monolith?
Well, I didn't know where I was going. That's the other thing. They don't tell you very much.
Really?
Yeah. You're sort of bundled onto a van and... You sort of like, where's it going? And I found out, and someone said, oh, Wandsworth. And I was like, I didn't really know where Wandsworth was because I'm a North London boy. There's this north-south rivalry in London. So it's like North London people don't like going south of the river. So I knew Wandsworth was somewhere south, but I didn't really know where south. And then when you get there, because you're in this tiny van, the van's big, you're in a tiny cubicle on the van, and you have these really small windows that obviously don't open, but you can sort of peer out. And so I rocked up, and there was this huge sort of, it's like a Tim Burton movie. It's the best way I can describe it. It's just this kind of gothic collapsing architecture, just filthy, and I think always deliberately designed to be as sort of imposing as possible. And then you sit on the van for ages, then they let you off, and then you get sort of sucked into the machine. There's this whole kind of process you go through to sort of make you prison ready.
Bit of a shock to the system, I would think.
Oh God, yeah, no, the adrenaline was absolutely hurtling through my system. And it's weird, I always say, and that's why I think there's a big problem with reoffending in this country. It's like, if I had to go to prison again, it wouldn't be so bad, because I'd know what to expect. And you see people who go to prison quite a few times, because there's a lot of people who reoffend and go back, and they're just completely relaxed. So the other people there were all completely chilled, because they knew what to expect, because I had no idea what was coming. That's why I was really... So the body's just flooded with adrenaline. It's fight or flight, and you can't do either of those things. So you're just this kind of nervous wreck with all this adrenaline going through.
Well, the book is almost a daily diary of your time in Wandsworth itself.
Yeah.
How did you find time to write that diary and make the notes even without your notepad?
Without my notepad. Well, I mean, one thing you do have a lot of is time. So that wasn't initially a problem, because you got nothing else to do. So and I just learned to be a magpie. You become very, very resourceful in prison. So I learned to, whenever I saw any paper, I would always grab some. And you had these like big outsized prison issue grey tracksuit bottoms, but they were quite good. They were about 8 sizes too big, but that was quite good, because it meant you could stuff things down them and sort of take things back to your cell. So paper, if I ever saw paper, I'd grab it. Bin liners, like having a bin liner was gold. So you grab bin liners, pens, and anything you'd see. You just got very, very used to sort of snaffling. I mean, not anything kind of important that would get me into trouble. I think if they searched me and found some paper, they wouldn't get too upset about it, because they're normally looking for like knives and drugs. But yeah, I just grabbed paper whenever I could, and then I just sat down each day and just sort of wrote out sort of longhand just what had happened that day. So I towards the end, I had piles, and like some mad professor, I just had piles and piles of A4 paper, which I found it really therapeutic. I found I'd never kept a diary before. I hadn't really done much long form writing before. I'd written sort of newspaper articles and stuff, but not like something of length. But I found it hugely therapeutic, and I worked it into my routine. And you'd think, well, that's going to kill a couple of hours. That'll get me between the 6 o'clock news. There's normally something good on telly about 9 o'clock. So it was the sort of, you'd watch the news, you'd watch the local news, and then it was the soaps, and I couldn't bear soaps. So between sort of 7 and 9 o'clock was like, that was my diary writing time. It was great.
So what was your first night like? And, obviously everyone fears who they're going to be banged up with.
Yeah, no, I was very lucky. I mean, I was very lucky throughout my sentence. I know people sort of look at me and go, oh, you poor unlucky sod. It's like, no, I landed on my feet in quite a few ways. So the person I moved in with, so the induction wings are normally where they keep people who are severely mentally ill and or what's called clucking, which is where they're going through drug withdrawal. So they come in high from drugs, and then obviously they're not on the drugs, and they start getting the DTs, and that makes their behaviour very erratic. So that's the big problem on induction wings, is you get put in with someone who's going to be a bit of a nightmare to share with. But I got in with someone who was straight out of Porridge. I mean, he was like a proper old school con, and he'd come to the end of a enormous sentence for drug smuggling, and then he'd absconded before the end of that because they wanted to pay some confiscation. He didn't want to pay them, so he skipped out of an open prison a couple of years before, and had been on his toes, on the Costa del Crime, and had literally just been picked up on a European arrest warrant and had been shipped back to Wandsworth. So he had landed at the same time as I had, so they put us in a cell together, thank God. And he was just like, look, this is going to be fine. You've obviously never been to prison before. Just stay close to me and everything will be all right. So I went, oh, thank you. He was a bit racist, but I had to sort of suck that up, really, because he was very good. He just knew how the system worked or didn't work, and how to get a shower, how to get a cup of tea, how to order your breakfast, all that stuff. He could he knew how to make that happen, which is very thankful.
Yes, indeed. And do you consider yourself lucky then in that way? Because
Oh yeah.
You were in some cases put in with someone not so nice.
Oh, later on I was, yeah. As I moved through the system, I mean, prison's like this weird game of snakes and ladders, and you kind of go up one ladder and then you're down a snake. So one day things are all going absolutely fine, the next day it all kind of completely unravels. So I was stuck on that wing for a while, and I wanted to get to one of the more wings with a more relaxed regime where you're going to get out your cell more. Because initially the problem when you're first locked up, you're stuck in a cell for 23 hours a day, sometimes more. And that's the true for hundreds and hundreds of people in the prison. So I initially completely lost my mind with that, because it was just like, well, what are we going to do? It's like, no, you just sit in your cell all day. And there's only so many diary entries you can do, only so many, episodes of the news you can watch. So, and it was very hot as well. It was July, so it was a bit of a heat wave, and there's no ventilation. It was just, you're dying in these cells. So I was sort of asking around and then you heard that, there's this wing over on a separate bit of the prison where more trusted prisoners go, and you get out your cells a lot more. You can do jobs, you can do education. And I was like, fuck, I want to go there, But they wouldn't move me directly to there. I had to sort of move through various wings to get to the promised land, which is called H Wing on Trinity. And then on the way, so I moved away from Ted, the old school con, and I did then share with a couple of nutcases. One in particular who was absolutely terrible. And that's the only time I felt really threatened, actually, in the prison, because you're in a cell with someone who's being a total nightmare and shouting at you and throwing your stuff around or whatever, and you're locked in, and you can't escape. You can't walk. You think, I'm going to walk away from the problem. It's like, no, you're stuck in the room with the problem, and you've got to live together and sleep together. So it was only a few days, but yeah, I think they were the longest 3 days of the sentence.
Well, what surprised you particularly? Do you think about the?
I suppose it was how badly run it was. It was the fact there's nothing for anyone to do, and lots of the people there, I don't think should have been there. They were just clearly had severe mental health problems, and that's why they were inside. But there was no treatment for them. They were literally locked in a cell and shouted at. And I was looking at these people going, God, they need professional help. It's quite obvious to anybody there's just something really mentally wrong with them. They weren't getting any help at all. They were just being siloed in this place, which was making them worse. So, and then they would misbehave, and then they get more punishment. I mean, people were given like extra days added on their sentence. So some people were never going to leave because they keep misbehaving, and then they get extra days, and they misbehave more, they get extra days. And it was just like this sort of terrible sort of never-ending decreasing circles of misery, really.
Being cut off from your family and your son was, I felt, a very hard part of your early time.
Yeah, no, and that never really went away. You just learned to cope with it, and I learned to maximize ways I could have contact. So initially, when you're first inside, you can't get on the phone because you had to fill in a form to get numbers approved so you could call out, but that took weeks. He couldn't come and visit because they said, we've got to check it before we let anyone come and visit you. We've got to check their criminal records. I was like, he's 4. So I couldn't talk to him on the phone. And he couldn't visit for the first few weeks. Yeah. And that's something that everybody goes through. And it's awful because that's the time you really need that contact. Like after a while, you learn to manage it and cope with not seeing my son every day. But when I went inside, he'd been living with me for half the week, and then suddenly there's no contact whatsoever. So, yeah, and it's just the endless, tedious bureaucracy of the place. You've got to fill in a form, that gets lost. You fill another form, they lose that. You send another form off to chase the first form, and the third form gets found, but then that's out of date, and it's just endless. Everything's run on paper. Like everyone's constantly filling in paper forms to get anything done. And that was it. Yes, so it was a huge sort of inefficiency of it was particularly soul destroying. So, yeah, but then after a few weeks, he started coming in to visit. I started getting phone calls. And then I realized that the more time I was out of my cell, the more opportunities I got to phone home. So that's why I suddenly started becoming a real sort of brown-nosing sort of oik to the officers, because it meant the nicer you were to the officers, the more you helped the officers, the more they'd let you out of the cell, and the more opportunities I had to phone home. So I suddenly started then, I actually then became quite busy as I got more and more jobs around the prison. And that was all really, it wasn't because I desperately wanted to help the prison run effectively. It was because I wanted to get out of my cell and speak to my son more.
Yes, it does come across that offenders, as they're called, were signing up for anything in order to get time away. various religious sects or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, God, no. I mean, I knew people who sort of said that they were, they were Protestant, they were Catholic, they were Jewish, they were Muslim, and so I signed up to everything just because it meant they got to go to all the different services. And also some of those services had quite nice food as well, or better food. So that was always a big advantage. But yeah, no, the joke I always say, and this is absolutely true, there were a lot of Muslims on my wing, and they all signed up to Alcoholics Anonymous. They all joined the AA. None of them drank ever. They'd never drunk in their lives, but they got to go. That's why they all went. They all got to hang out with their mates like once a week. So it was all these little, and it did turn into something like a kind of black farce, or like The Great Escape or something like that, because everyone had their little angles. Everyone had their little ways that they could buck the system just to get out the cell. Because you got out the cell, so you got to phone home. You also got a shower, because quite often days would go by and you just weren't able to have a shower, which in that heat was disgusting. So just being able to get out the cell and have a shower felt like you'd beaten the system for a day. It was like a game, and it became quite enjoyable. I mean, not enjoyable, but it became quite distracting. Like the mission to get out the cell and have a shower was just like all-consuming, basically. And when you got it, you felt like $1 million, because you were like, yes, I beat the system.
Well, the system, of course, is rife with drugs. How did you get on with avoiding that?
Well, it wasn't hard, actually, because, I'm partial to a bit of fun in my life, but it just didn't seem to, the drugs in prison, it's almost exclusively a drug called spice, which is a synthetic version of cannabis. And I stopped smoking cannabis when I was sort of in my 20s. So it wasn't that I was sort of, that tempted me at all. And also the spice thing was just so destructive, and it was lethal, and quite evidently so. So you'd see people on it and you'd see them collapse in front of you. They'd be having a toke, and then, they'd just go down and need to get carted off to the medical wing or worse. So it wasn't a drug that sold itself particularly well. But yeah, it was absolutely endemic, and it was so obviously coming in via people in the visits hall. Occasionally people would fly a drone in, but mostly it was just corrupt officers who would bring it in, because the profits were just so vast. I mean, so at one point I sat down with a guy who was dealing spice on our wing, and I just chatted with him and got about the economics of it. And he was saying that he could, like, an ounce of spice would cost him maybe about £150 to buy on the outside. And within the prison, he could sell it. If he split it up and sold it to all these addicts, he could sell it for over £2,000. So, look at the return on that. I mean, so you can see why everybody was kind of getting involved with it. And also because there was nothing to do. There was nothing for these people to do other than sit in their room and smoke spice. And also a lot of the time, the people who had mental health problems weren't getting treatment or medicated. So they were self-medicating with spice, obviously not very effectively. But that was the only thing they could take just to escape this world for a few hours. So yeah, it was kind of everywhere, really.
Well, mental health, I think you mentioned there. You got pretty well involved with that, because you became what they call a listener. Indeed.
So when I was sort of first there was this thing called the listener scheme, which was if you were feeling suicidal or feeling like you're self-harming, you could call a listener. And I had some pretty bad nights, but I never got quite that bad. But then I then got introduced to some of the prisoners who were listeners, and they just had the best life. Their doors were never locked. They were in and out their cells. You'd see them just wandering around the wings and chatting to officers. Everyone would be locked away, and the listeners were sort of wandering around the place. And they had the better cells. The officers used their first name. They got showers when they wanted. It was like the VIP club of prison. So obviously I was attracted to that. But I also thought it'd be a really fascinating thing to do. So you could sign up and volunteer, which I did. And then you get trained. So the Samaritans came in and give you quite an intensive training course. And then I shared a cell with a guy, I call him Scott in the book. And he'd been there he'd been inside for 2 years. And so he'd been listening all that time. So he was really, really experienced. So he kind of trained me. He was like my mentor. So I went out and did lots of sessions. Well, I just sat with him. I didn't say anything. I just sat with him and watched him sort of work his magic. And yeah, you were called to see people who were literally completely at the end of their rope and were debating whether or not to kill themselves. And what was quite interesting was it wasn't your job to talk them out of it. Because you think in that situation, you go, don't do it. Think of your kids. Don't do it. You go, okay, well, why do you want to do it? What makes you think that, what's in your life that's so bad that makes you want to do that? Have you thought about when you're going to do it? Have you thought about a method? And just really open-ended questions to sort of tease all of the heartache and misery that's going on inside them, just get them to talk about it. And that simple act of getting them, which is it's harder than it thinks, because a lot of the time they're really incommunicative. So actually getting them to talk about it is really difficult sometimes. Some of them won't shut up, but a lot of the time it's they're guys. Guys don't often talk about their feelings, especially in that environment. It's quite alien to them. So, but getting them to talk about it means they get all the emotion out of the system, and they're just less likely to do it. That's what the research shows.
Well, you got onto the listener program, but
Yeah.
I think it was a bit of a double-edged sword, wasn't it, for you? In that, you have to take on some of what the prisoners,
Oh yeah, I mean, look. Don't get me wrong. I got the perks, and it was extraordinarily fascinating and very worthwhile. But yeah, you're not, as you said before. A lot of the people who we were called to deal with had severe mental health problems, and we weren't trained to deal with that. And there wasn't help we could give them. Like, they needed a course of CBT, or they needed medication, or they needed to not be in Wandsworth. They needed proper help, and we weren't able to give them that. And then you were just sitting there going, I haven't really been able to help this guy. And he's going back to his cell, and he's probably going to self-harm. You see him the next day, and he had self-harmed. So you were thinking, I haven't been able to help this person. And it makes you feel pretty impotent and powerless. So yeah, that in itself was extraordinarily upsetting and stressful. So yeah, it was extremes. Sometimes you felt like I've really just helped possibly save someone's life and feel quite good about myself. And then the next time you just think, I've been no help whatsoever, and this person is still in a terrible state, and I haven't been able to do anything about it. And that would make you feel, you wouldn't sleep that night.
The privileges, though, meant that you had a double-sized cell to use, which was a bit of a luxury. Yeah,
I mean, I think if you moved into it now, you'd look around it and go, what the hell is this? Doorman, get me another room. So yeah, as opposed to compared to other cells in Wandsworth, it was much, much nicer. And it was mostly just the size. Because when you're in the normal cells, and there's two of you, they are 6 foot by 12 foot. And you've got to have 2 beds in there, and a loo, and a sink, and a desk, which is where you eat. And that's it. There's no room. You can't both stand up at the same time, really. So they're pretty cramped and claustrophobic. So when I moved into the bigger cell, which is like the listener cell, which is where I spent most of my sentence, that was extraordinary, because suddenly you had space to sort of walk around. So even when you were sort of locked up, you had some movements, and that was just such a massive sort of shift. But look, the reason we had that cell was a lot of the time, if someone was a repeat customer, if it was a prisoner who was calling for help, who I'd seen a few times before, I would get them into my cell and deal with it in my cell, just because we had comfy chairs, and we had a table, more comfortable chairs, and a table, and we could make them a cup of tea, and it was a bit more relaxed. Where normally, when we were doing our listener work, there was a listener cell, which was just horrible. It was just complete, because people would go mad in there. So it literally had 3 plastic chairs and an ashtray and an open loo, and that was it. And there was like graffiti on the walls. It stank of cigarette smoke, because people smoked in there all the time. And it was pretty horrible. And there's these strip lights above, which were really, really harsh. So it was just like a room in a lunatic asylum, which I suppose it was in a way. So a lot of the listening would happen in that very, very unfriendly place. So when I felt comfortable with someone, I'd say, look, come into my cell and chat with me in here. Because we had mood lighting, but we'd soften the lights, and it was just a more relaxed. We could put the radio on and just chill. And that was a huge help to some people.
You wouldn't have thought that when you were going in, that you would become a listener, and really, you're very brave as well, because you're dealing with what we perceive as murderers and drug addicts and what have you. Well,
no, there was quite a lot of that. I mean, but it teaches you to sort of look at things and look at people from the other end of the telescope. So a lot of times I wouldn't know what people had done. Like, you wouldn't ask and they wouldn't tell. I mean, sometimes it comes up, sometimes it wouldn't, but it wasn't important to what was happening right then at that moment. What was happening at that moment in time was their wife wasn't calling them back, or their cellmate's a nutter, or they owe a load of money on the wing and they're going to get beaten up. It's like, and that's the problem. That's what they've come to you with, this problem. And it's not, 6 years ago I stabbed someone. Do you see? So it doesn't. The two, they're not walking around the whole time going, I'm a manslaughter convict, and you look at them going, oh, you're a manslaughter convict. I'm going to totally deal with you through that lens. It was often completely irrelevant. So a lot of times you wouldn't know what people had done, and also the people. Look, I got to know loads of people who committed murder, and they were fine. I never had we didn't call them murderers, we called them lifers because they're serving life. And they were fine. Like, I never had a problem with lifers. And the people who you had most problems with would be in for street crime. Do you see? So you learn to disconnect the offence and who the person is. And you just go, well, I'm going to deal with them as they are right now. And yeah, sometimes people would be in a terrible state. Or sometimes, I remember an officer waking me up because you'd be on a 24-hour rota. You'd be on duty all through the night. Because often that's when people would actually kill themselves in the night, and that's when they call a listener. So 3 a.m, someone calls, you've got to go. And the officers would come into my cell and wake me up. And it'd be the night officers. They'd all be like dressed up in these almost like riot gear, and they'd come in and just prod me away. That little torch, he's shining a torch in my face. Go, all right, Chris. All right, Gov. He goes, yeah, we've got this guy on the fours, which is like the top landing, and it's always like there be dragons. The fours are always for the nutters. And he said, yeah, we've got this guy up there, and he's tried to stab an officer earlier. Do you want to come and talk to him and calm him down? And I was like, okay. So that's how he sold him to me. And I was like, you've got to be mad to stab an officer. You've got to be pretty mad. But I'd go and talk to him. But 99 times out of 100, they'd be fine with me because literally they were at war with everyone. They'd be at war with the other prisoners, with the officers, with their families. And you're the one person who's going to say, all right, mate, how are you feeling? Can I help? And you're the only one who's going to be nice to them and help them. And something quite primitive kicks in, which means they're actually quite civil with you. A few times someone would threaten me, but if you thought there were going to be a problem, you'd do what was called listening through the door. So they'd be locked in their cell, and they'd be inside and I'll be outside, and I'd just literally chat to them through a tiny crack in the door, which wasn't very nice because everyone can hear what's going on and that you're talking through a door, but it just meant there's like that much solid steel between, and sometimes they would go, oh, you bastard, or whatever, and I'd just go, bye, and walk away. So I never, there were a few hairy moments, but like no more than, like I live in central London, and sometimes you get some drunk bloke coming up to you on the tube and you're like, oh, do you know, so it didn't seem any worse than that, I'll be honest.
Well, it obviously affected you because you decided to do a psychology course at Open University. How did you manage to enroll with that? And was that possible? Yeah,
I mean, it was weird. It was so surreal in Wandsworth. There were, like, you couldn't get loo roll some days. You couldn't, phone home. The showers wouldn't work. I mean, basic human functioning didn't work. But on some things, there was really kind of quite good at. So they had a distance learning department there, and they could enrol you on Open University courses. And at the start, I was just looking for things to occupy myself and just looking at ways to fill the hours. And I thought, bloody hell, a degree. Look, I'm inside for 2.5 years. You can do a degree in 3 years. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just sign up. And it was OU, so you could do it module by module. So I thought, even though I just do 2 modules and then, pack it in, then that's, it's taken up a lot of time. And yeah, I suppose it was through the listening and just general interest in human nature, really. I've always been fascinated with psychology and read lots of kind of pop science books about it. But I thought, oh, well, that's something I could sign up to. So yeah, I enrolled with the OU, and it took like a week. It was weird, and I couldn't get on the phone to people, like this whole thing I couldn't do. But they turned up within a week and go, we put you on this OU course, and you've now started, and here's your week 1, and now you're going to have your and I was like, oh, okay. So it was brilliant. I loved it because it was all, and the OU has been doing stuff in prisons for 25 years, and there's all these like bank robbers who turn out to then be chemical engineers and stuff. So it's very effective. Obviously, if people look, I already had a degree. I had a kind of legitimate life, I guess. But lots of people who've been through the system a lot, they left school at 14, got no qualifications. They've never had a paid job. So if you can take someone like that and give them a degree, and often the time they're really smart. It's not that they're stupid. They just got sucked into a criminal lifestyle. They're really, really smart. I knew guys who ran drugs empires who were just like, I was like, my God, if you could turn that into something legitimate, you could be running Goldman Sachs in a few years. So there's a good history of the OU doing that. So I just jumped on that bandwagon, and yeah, it was brilliant.
What was it like making friends in that way, and quite close friends at the time, of course, because of the environment? And then they move on. They move out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you do make extraordinarily good friends, and I'm still very good friends with lots of people I did time with, because you kind of the best ways I can describe it is like when people are soldiers, like there are soldiers on the front. I read lots of military history books, like any middle-aged man, and you see people who become very close friends in a very short period of time when they're in the trenches together, because you're both facing this extraordinary peril. And you both could die at any minute, and it makes people bond in a very powerful way. And you see it now. People come back from Afghanistan and they sort of still want to help each other out and stuff, which is wonderful. So because of that, we were all facing extraordinary hardship and suffering and jeopardy. You got to bond with people very, very well. And I think it was a huge relief when I moved into cells with people who weren't nutcases. There was a huge kind of, oh my God, you're not a nutcase. I'm going to be so nice to you. Because I've had to deal with people who aren't very personable. So I shared a cell with a guy called, this is his real name, a guy called Martin Dodgson, and he was former managing director of Deutsche Bank, and he had been put away for 4.5 years for insider trading. And he'd only been in the prison about a month more than me, but by the time I moved in with him, he already just knew how everything worked, and he was already going, right, we're going to sign up to this, we're going to put down this, we can get out of the cell here, and he was on it. And I had a great time with him. And I always say we laughed more in those. We shared a cell for about 2 or 3 months. And I laughed more in that cell with him than I think I have at any other point in my life. Because you're just constantly trying. A lot of it's nervous laughter, but you're just trying to cheer each other up. So you're just constantly cracking jokes, constantly using dark humour, and laughing at the madness of Wandsworth. Like neither of us could just believe how insane the place was. So yeah, but then suddenly you turn and then they're gone. They've been moved to another prison. They get slipped the night before. They're on a bus. They're off somewhere else. So suddenly they're wrenched out of your life, and you're like, oh my God, am I even going to see them again? And someone else moves in. You've got to deal with all that. So yeah, it's quite brutal.
You thought you were only going to be in Wandsworth for a few months, and we're looking at becoming categorised as a non-violent or less of a threat. But that took quite a long time, didn't it? Yeah,
there was a lot of. As I say, it's snakes and ladders again. So in order to get out of Wandsworth, I had to be categorised as a Cat D prisoner, because I was initially a Cat C prisoner. And you can only get to open prison if you're a Cat D prisoner. So you have to go through this tortuous bureaucratic process of getting categorised and getting them to assess you, which actually should take about 2 minutes, but takes about 3 months. Because they just look at you going, oh, you're white collar, your first time offence, there's no violence. You fit the criteria, the legal criteria for open prison. And guess what? It's going to save the system so much money to send you to open prison, because open prisons are very, very cheap to run, because there's hardly any officers there. Because it'll cost a lot of money to keep someone like me in Wandsworth. So you'd think the system would go, oh, let's process him, let's get him out quickly, we'll save thousands of pounds. But no, the process of rubber stamping my Cat D application took about 3 months, longer than it should do. So I ended up staying in Wandsworth for about 9 months. But the thing is, it was all time off the total. So it wasn't like my sentence was longer by 9 months. And actually, it meant that when I got to open prison, it meant I was that closer to the point of actually leaving the whole system. But also, this is a very odd thing, and I still haven't quite understood why. Time passed in those last few months of Wandsworth, because I knew exactly what was happening. I had my whole life sorted. I was in a nice big cell. I was really busy. I was writing my diary. I was doing my degree. Time passed extraordinarily quickly. I would sit there. You'd just blink, and another week would go by. There's something odd about that place. The mad chaos and the dysfunctionality of Wandsworth was just something about it. Just sucked you through time. Because then when I got to open prison, time slowed right down again. Like days took far longer to pass. Weeks took far longer to pass. So I don't actually, in retrospect, begrudge those last 3 months I had to stay extra in Wandsworth. So I've got some great material for the book. Like some really interesting things happened in that time, and also that time just seemed to whiz by for me.
As a true documentary maker, of course, you've made quite a lot of comment politically about the system, and you reference various MPs who came and went, promising lots and didn't deliver anything.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite weird that when I was, and it was quite useful for the book, but when I was inside, prisons became suddenly big news. I think the prison crisis really exploded in a way they couldn't keep a lid on. It had been simmering for years and years and years. Because what happened is that from 2010, obviously, the coalition government came in with this mandate of austerity and cut public budgets across the board. But the one that bore the biggest brunt was justice. Obviously, the courts, a lot of people know about the huge backlog in the courts. They've cut the courts budget hugely, shut down lots of criminal courts, cut legal aid. But the prison system lost about £1 billion of its budget. And I think it went from 4 billion to 3 billion. So it lost a vast amount of its resources. And that manifested itself through officer cuts. They just cut the number of officers, but the number of prisoners stayed the same. So the number of officers, the officer to prisoner ratio shot up. And that meant that it was just became harder and harder and harder just to keep the places running, especially if it's as inefficient as Wandsworth. So because of that, a lot of things in 2016, 2017, which is when I was away, a lot of things exploded into the public domain. There was a lot of riots, and there were a lot of high number of self-inflicted deaths. And there was a lot of documentaries showing how easy it was to get drugs into prisons. It was just a bad year for prisons. So it became quite heavy in the public eye. And the Justice Secretary at the time was Liz Truss, who clearly, when she took the job, knew nothing about prisons. You could just tell. It was one of those ministerial appointments. They get like tossed out like playing cards. It's like, oh, you can have prisons. She clearly didn't want to do it. She obviously wanted to be in the Foreign Office or something cool like that. So that sort of, the rot kind of started there. And yeah, I mean, as you said, these ministers come and ministers go. So she was there for about 9 months. She was there the exact amount of time I was, actually. She turned up as I turned up and left when I left. So it was quite nice for the book. It sort of bookends it. But then they brought another Justice Secretary and he was there for 6 months. And they brought another one in and they were there for like 4 months. And they keep on rattling through them. And that means that the system never has any long-term direction and focus. It's constant disaster management. And yeah, with the amount of officers that they've cut, it's never going to become a functional prison system until they start pouring more resources into it.
Well, you know, the whole book is really about the 9 months, and you do get chipped out eventually.
Yes.
It's not a spoiler.
No, I do leave. Yeah.
And really, you pretty much make a cursory reference to it, really, because it was one thing that struck me was that when you arrived there, you were almost agoraphobic. Completely.
And bear in mind, I've been in a big cell. So when you get to open prison and suddenly you're walking across a lawn, it was just like the whole world was caving in. I just wasn't used to it. I wasn't used to seeing people that far away. And I wasn't used to just being, there you go to that hut, turn up here at lunch, do what you want in the meantime. There's no locks on the doors. And if there's a gate, if you want to leave, you can just leave. I mean, they'll come and arrest you and send you back to Wandsworth. Lots of people do abscond. But yeah, it's deliberate. It's a deliberate, like, increasing your level of freedom. So when you are then released into the real world, you don't have sort of massive problems with that. And a lot of people do. They say they want to go back. So 2 days in, I was saying, take me back to Wandsworth. But everyone goes through that. It's a weird thing. And I was only in Wandsworth for 9 months. There were people who were getting off the bus who had been in prison for 20 years, like in a closed prison like Wandsworth for 20 years, and then suddenly went to open prison. So they were sort of, really all over the place. But you soon adapt. Within a few weeks, you're like, okay, yeah, I don't want to go back to Wandsworth. I'm just staying here. The food's better. The visits were so much better because in Wandsworth there was all the security, there was all the kind of theatre of restriction of dogs and officers and radios and fingerprints and everyone being searched 5 times. So visiting me at Wandsworth was a horrible experience for friends and family. But in Ford, which is the open prison, it's just like, there's a room, get on with it. You walk in, you walk out. They could bring me newspapers. They would walk in with sandwiches and I'd be on, there was a coffee machine, you could get a cappuccino. It was incredible. So it was a very, very different experience coming to open prisons.
And obviously being able to re-establish your full relationship with your son.
Yeah, I mean, the visits were 2 hours long. So in Wandsworth, visits were 1 hour long. Visits were 2 hours long at Ford. And you could run around and play with him. Like, he was 5 by then. So he wants to play it and, hide and seek and roll around on the floor, which you can't do in Wandsworth. You stand up in Wandsworth, they're like, they're on you. But at Ford, there was a whole outside area with a picnic table and you could run around and play hide and seek. And do all stuff like that, which from a father-son thing was really, really, really important. So yeah, it was kind of life-changing. And 2 hour, 1 hour visits are just never long enough. You just always, they're looking at the watch, you think, oh God, have I said everything? Have I had enough time with them? But 2 hours is enough. 2 hours was fine. Like, we're done now. See you next week. Then after a while, if you behave, they let you go out on day release. So I start after about a year of that. Was it a year of that? No, it wasn't. God, it happened quite quick. So after about 6 months of that, I was then allowed to start going out and go to the zoo or go to my ex's house and have tea with him and stuff. So you almost ease yourself away from visiting the prison. So Kit, my son, he doesn't really remember visiting me now, because the last year and a bit, I'd see him all the time, but I'd see him out of the prison. So he didn't even need to come into the open prison grounds. He'd just see me out and about. And it was just, you start to, the lens widens and widens and widens until it's almost like, there's no prison there at all.
We're coming to the end of our chat, and it's fascinating to talk with you, and I could talk a lot longer. A couple of things. I think your epilogue in the book actually is more of a report on what you'd send into the new Ministry of Justice. Yeah. If
they put me in charge, I just think from the documentaries I'd made previously, when you had sort of set out a stall saying, this I'm going to introduce you to a problem with the world you didn't know existed, and I learned that you can't really do that, or you shouldn't do that unless you've got something positive to add and say, well, look, here's a solution. And it's not that necessarily the solutions are going to be acted on, but I think people feel kind of really depressed and cheated if you're just going to say, here's this thing, it's terrible, I have no idea what to do about it. People get quite annoyed at that. I've learned that in my films. So I thought it was best to say, look, here are some solutions if you want them. But it's not, the stuff I'm putting there isn't controversial at all. It's like, if you go to the Prison Reform Trust, they'll say the same thing. If you go to the Howard League for Prison Reform, they'll say the same thing. You go to most MPs off record, they'll say exactly the same thing. Like, everyone knows what to do to fix the system. It's just having the political will to force it through. But yeah, it's more resources for more officers, better mental health treatment, and bring prisons into the modern age. They're still stuck in I joke, I said, like, bring them into the 20th century would be a start. Some of them are still in the 19th century. So it's it's just modernization and efficiency and all the stuff that they've done in other parts of the public service. You're maybe a bit older than me, but you remember how awful the National Rail Service was. It was terrible in the 90s, and it was modernized, and yes, privatization was disastrous, so forth. But hospitals as well. I remember what hospitals were like when I was a child, and now they are modernized. But that hasn't happened to the prison system. So it's just modernization and efficiency, and then you'll find that the prisons are given space to rehabilitate, because that's the big thing. At the moment, they don't rehabilitate; they make people worse, and people walk out and commit more crime, and they go back to prison, and they're stuck on this huge cycle of reoffending. But if prisons were able to do their job effectively, they could break that cycle. But at the moment, they just enhance it.
Well, a couple of things then. We haven't really mentioned food.
Normally, that's you want to know about is the food.
Yeah. What about the food?
The food. I mean, I like everything. You just get used to it. I mean, initially it was horrendous, not just in terms of the quality, but the quantity. So you were. Oh God, it just almost makes you weep to think of it. But you basically got one hot meal a day, and even that, I think, it stretched the definition of hot, especially on the induction wing. There's no big mess hall. There's no big dining area. There used to be in the old days, but now, because of overcrowding, and they can't just have that many people out on the wings at once, you eat in your cells. So you go down to the servery hatch, and there's a sort of line of hot plates or warm plates, and they splat something on your plate. You don't know what it is. You've no idea what they're giving you. It's lukewarm. You get like a slice of bread if you're lucky, and then you take it back to your cell. But that could be up 2 flights of stairs and a longer landing and all that stuff. By the time you get back to your cell, it's cold because it's on a blue plastic plate. And you sort of, what is this? And that's your one hot meal a day. And then you get like a baguette. But the meals are always at weird times. So lunch was like at 11. And dinners are like at 3:30 or something. You're getting to 8 at night, and you're like, I'm fucking starving here. And breakfast, you get a breakfast pack, which is like some cling film or a little plastic bag with like 3 cornflakes in or something, and a tiny carton of milk. You know those fun-sized milk cartons? Yeah, so one of them, 3 tea bags or something like that. So you just think, I'm never going to survive. I don't know how we can eat. And obviously, you're not expecting 5-star cuisine, but these are grown adults. You need to sort of give them enough to live on. So what happens is then people start ordering off what's called a canteen. Now, this is a confusing name because the canteen is the word for the prison shop. And if you have money coming in or you earn money within the prison system, at the end of each week you get these sheets. Everything's done on paper. These paper sheets, and you can go and tick like, oh, an extra chocolate bar, an extra carton of milk, and sweets and just sustenance like that. So you then a week later, your canteen delivery would come, and it was like this big plastic sack, and that gets dumped outside your cell. Hopefully no one will nick it. And then that means you can have some nice coffee. You can have some more. Ryvita was good. I got really into Ryvita. So, and then you can, if you've got resources, which I did, you can then supplement the horrible prison food with your own canteen. But then when I got into like the VIP lane, when I was in the listener cell with Scott, he was like, "What the hell are you doing?" I'd come with my food from the server. He's like, "What the hell are you? We don't eat that shit," because he would cook, and he had various different kettles and various little implements and ways. So he would cook most nights. So after a while, I stopped eating the food from the servery, and we just cook our own.
Well, it's a fascinating story, a great read for everyone, Chris. And one of the things I was just going to quote you on, which was, if my time in Wandsworth taught me anything, it's that good people can do bad things. I think that's quite a...
Yeah, that about sums it up.
And will we see then, are you going to be the executive producer of Shawshank Redemption, the sequel?
There's a telly thing in the works. I mean, I've been in the media business long enough to never get particularly excited about things until they actually happen. So yeah, there's a telly development based on the book, which I'm sort of involved in writing. But it kind of more interestingly for me is just following stuff up. So I did. I had all these contacts. I had all these really interesting people I'd met when I was in prison. And I wanted to do a documentary, but none of them would be interviewed on camera because there's a lot of stigma about being seen as an ex-prisoner, and people are defined by their offence and their past and so forth. But I said to them, well, what if I just record your voice and I change your name? And they said, oh no, yeah, we'd do that. So I recorded did all these audio recordings of ex-prisoners about their time inside. So the book's about my time inside, and these recordings, I did about 20 interviews, and they go on for hours with these ex-cons. And again, like prison itself, some of it's very dark, some of it's very funny, some of it's very weird. And so I made that into a podcast series. So I've done a podcast series called A Bit of a Stretch, which is basically me in conversation with these ex-prisoners, some of whom are now back inside. They're real prisoners again. So that did pretty well. And then I'm sort of morphing that into a follow-up book. I'm going to write another book about why people go back. So if prison's so terrible, why do people keep going back inside? So there's no shortage of people to write about.
No shortage of material either. Well, fascinating it is. Chris, thanks very much for joining us here at the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. And the book, as you say, is A Bit of a Stretch, Atlantic Books, and it's $16.99. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for participating in the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwell's Bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors and supporters who've sustained the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it will be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge.